The following Truth Barista podcast is a High Beam Ministry production.
So essentially, we groom firstborn children for success. Because although the firstborns are the movers and shakers of life, they are architects, they are accountants, they are engineers in huge numbers. Anywhere where perfection is paid off, they're going to do extremely well in life. But here's the kicker. That skill that makes you good in your profession is exactly the skill that works against you in your relationship with those you love.
Welcome to the Erzatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Truth Barista last week was so good, as it always is, but it was really even more special because I think you were hitting on principles and stories of the Bible that we don't hear in that kind of context. And in that context was the patriarchal system, which you explained very well. So why don't you remind us again of what that patriarchal system is about?
No, and it's kind of funny that you should mention that, because when was the last time you heard a sermon on patriarchs and firstborn sons, right?
Well, never. I mean, very rare. I mean, once in a while we'll touch a little bit on it, but it didn't go in the kind of depth that you brought.
Well, and that's what I really enjoy doing, and I think it adds so much meaning to the words that we're reading, and that's where I want to go. Let's explain it. So, first of all, the family in ancient Israel revolved around the father. The father was the patriarch. He was going to eventually die, but the family would continue through the generations, so there had to be a patriarch in training, or a patriarch in waiting, and that would be the firstborn son. So the father would invest himself into this firstborn son so that when he dies, the firstborn son steps up and does exactly what the patriarch needs to do.
I would think that every sibling after the firstborn really was always kind of ticked at that firstborn, right?
In our culture it is, and I'm pretty sure according to human nature, yeah, it kind of weaves its way through.
Well, because that's the privileged, right?
You think it's privileged, do you?
Well, he's getting all the attention of the father. He gets a double portion of the inheritance when the father dies. I mean, yeah, if I was second, third, or fourth down the rung of the birth order, I'd be pretty mad.
Okay, well, since you bring that up, why don't we talk about privilege of the firstborn, Mr. Snarky McSnark? Okay, well, you're right. The firstborn had a privilege, but it wasn't the, darling, you're going to get all the money here, and then you and your wife can go sit on the French Riviera and just enjoy yourselves while the rest of the family just pines away. No, that's not what was a part of all of this.
Was that Thurston Howell?
I do believe it was, lovey. You go sit on a deserted island somewhere. Anyway, why do you do this to me? You make me do things like this. Okay, anyway, the firstborn son had two very important things. First of all, they had rights within the family that the other kids didn't have, but they also primarily had responsibilities. As the father was responsible to take care of the family, to lead the family, to provide for the family, and to restore those family members that got kind of on the fringes there or sold themselves off, this would be the same responsibility that fell to the firstborn shoulders. Their job was to take over the family corporation, so to speak, and to serve as the chairman of the board. So they were given two things that were very important: the birthright and the blessing. The birthright is the responsibilities and everything that goes with it. You get the birthright, and it's a right by birth to be the leader of the family and to take care of the whole operation. But you also got a blessing. Why? How do you run a company if you don't have resources? So the father would will, so to speak, his inheritance to the firstborn so that the firstborn had enough resources to fulfill his duty. This is why when the firstborn received the inheritance, he received 2 portions as opposed to every other male sibling's 1 portion.
So really what he got was his portion,
Yep.
plus a management portion.
That's exactly what it was. Why? Because when the father died, he would leave behind sometimes a wife. Who's going to take care of the wife? It's the firstborn. How is the firstborn going to do it out of a single portion? It's not. So what he does is he gets this management portion to take care of the wife until she dies. That's his job. Also, if he has any unmarried sisters, his job was to take care of his unmarried sisters. He would house them, clothe them, feed them, and they would all work together in the family homestead. So his job, he was kind of locked into his course in life. A secondborn could go off and do whatever they wanted to do. A thirdborn, fourth, whatever. They had more freedom. But the firstborn was duty bound to take care of the family, to serve and not be served. Does that now begin to open things up?
I love it. I love when you put it in those terms.
So he was the patriarch in training. He took on the full duties when his father died. And even though he was his own man, I mean, he would do things his way. He had fatherly duties to fulfill, just like his father before him. So he got this double portion to take care of all of the duties. It wasn't he couldn't spend it on selfishness, for selfishness' sake. He didn't receive these things out of favoritism. They were there for a purpose, to carry out the tasks. Now, if he carries out the family responsibility, he better have the full blessings to carry it out. So this is why at the father's death, or if the father thought he was approaching death, he would call his firstborn son in, lay his hands on his firstborn son, and ask God's blessing on him beyond the inheritance that he was physically giving him. And he was saying, Lord, you are our king, our father of the human family. Bless this firstborn son of mine with all of the blessings he needs to fulfill all of his duties to take care of his family.
So was that blessing permanent?
That's what's interesting. In the Bible, you see that the blessings actually had an effect. You saw Isaac prosper. You saw Abraham prosper. You saw Jacob prosper. Let's think of it this way. As far as blessings and curses, we often think curses have a greater effect than blessings. But then if a blessing is given to somebody and it's lined up with God's will, why wouldn't God then bless that person?
Well, but in the Bible story where Esau and Jacob were blessed, Jacob was blessed instead of Esau. I mean, why couldn't he just reverse it? I mean, say, okay, wrong guy, let's get the right guy in here.
Because at that time, it was believed a blessing once given was effective and could not be revoked.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so now that you brought it up, let's talk about these fun firstborns, okay? So we may do a firstborn quiz here.
Oh, goody.
Okay, I have 3 firstborns in mind, and I want to see, Bible scholar, if you know who they are. Okay, Abraham had a firstborn son. Who was that firstborn son?
Well, it was Isaac.
Wrong.
Really? Oh, no, it wasn't. You're right.
You've been caught by the Truth Barista. It was Ishmael his firstborn son. In fact,
that's right.
Ishmael was 13 years old when Isaac was born. So who technically is the firstborn of Abraham?
Well, Ishmael.
Ishmael was, okay. But who was really chosen to be the firstborn?
Was Isaac.
Isaac, okay. Here's another one.
Well, that was because of the bloodline, though, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay. There were 2 boys. There were twins born down the line of Isaac and Rebekah, and they were 2 boys. Do you remember their names? Jacob and Esau. Very good. Okay. So who was the firstborn?
Well, Esau was.
Yeah. How did they identify that he was the firstborn? Because they were twins.
He came out first.
No. See,
well, it was something to do with a foot.
He stuck a body part out. I can't remember at this point if it was a hand or foot. I think it was an arm. And they tied a red string around it because they knew she was having twins. You have to identify the firstborn. So they tied the string around his leg, let's say it was. But the leg went back in. And then Jacob came out instead of Esau. So Esau was the first to break the womb, as they call it. That's a firstborn son. But Jacob came out first. He emerged ahead of Esau. God had already prophesied to Rebekah that Jacob would take the primary position over Esau. So this is not in her control, right?
Right.
But God prophesied to it, and then all of a sudden it happened. So now she knows, even though Esau broke the womb first as firstborn, Jacob is destined by God, because birth is an act of God, to be the firstborn.
I wouldn't have wanted to be at that birthing.
Now, this is where all of this gets really interesting. Now, out of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was born as a second-born made firstborn, who was the firstborn?
Reuben.
Very good. Reuben was a firstborn. Now, that is...
Well, he was so important, they had a sandwich named after him.
Exactly. And Joseph's mom was the Rachel. Very good. Okay, now that we've had this kind of fun, I want to talk about appointment, and then I'm going to appoint you to go get me a cup of coffee, okay?
Oh,
okay,
good.
Hold tight.
Just like the firstborn.
So,
giving orders.
By birth, you have Ishmael, Esau, and Reuben, but firstborn status is not limited by birth. It's also limited by God's choice. You see, God's the one who does this. He's behind it all. You can be disqualified. You can be dismissed. You can lose it through disobedience. Are you ready for this?
Mm-hmm.
Ishmael was not qualified to be the firstborn, though he was by human standards, because he was born of Abraham and Hagar, an Egyptian concubine, so to speak, a slave woman, an auxiliary wife, if you want to call it that way, or servant of Sarah. But the firstborn that God was looking at had to be the firstborn of Abraham and Sarah. And there was a reason behind that, but for now, Ishmael was disqualified because he wasn't born of the covenant parents. Number 2, you could be dismissed. Esau rejected his birthright, his status as firstborn son, by flippantly selling it to Jacob. Now, Esau meant it flippantly, but Jacob took it seriously. And by the way, we better watch what we say before God, because God took it seriously. Because Jacob was destined to be the firstborn. Esau selling it, it's like, well, if you're going to do that, I'll take it. I'll buy it for a bowl of soup. Not a bad deal, huh?
Yeah, and it was chicken noodle.
But then again, what was Jacob buying? He was buying responsibility.
Yeah.
But maybe in Jacob's mind, he was buying the inheritance as well, the double portion. Because let's face it, Abraham and Isaac were very rich men. Okay, that could be part of it. And as an immature little brat, and when you read the story, he kind of was a snarky little kid, young man, let's put it that way. So he buys the birthright, and what has to follow the birthright? If you get the birthright, you need the blessing. So now you jump to the story of receiving the blessing, and just like Esau goes out to get the food, Jacob comes in around him, sneaks the blessing, because Isaac is blind, can't tell. And I often laugh because how did Jacob disguise himself? He put on Esau's clothes and put lamb skins on his arms because Esau was hairy. And at one point, Isaac feels him and he goes, well, it feels like Esau, but it sounds like Jacob. And then he pulls him near and he gives him a big hug and he goes, you know, the voice sounds like Jacob, but it sure smells like Esau. And so I'm thinking it's like, can Jacob put on Eau de Goat and grime number 5? So anyway, so he gets the blessing. Well, it may have been a sneaky way of doing it, but the blessing belongs to the birthright. And if God told Jacob he was to be the firstborn, he needed the blessing. I think God could have given him the blessing the right way, but God was maybe circumventing Isaac's blindness to get it to the right place.
But Jacob means usurper.
Yes, it does.
But was that his nature?
That's a very good point. Yes, he was. And this is what God had to break from this firstborn to get him prepared for his job. It's like, Jacob, you can't be a firstborn if you're going to keep trying to work everything to your advantage. Because a firstborn isn't working for his advantage, he's working it to the family's advantage. And everything from the point after he snuck the birthright, all the way through his struggle with Laban, who, by the way, did the same thing to him, to show him, so, you like apples? How do you like them apples, right? When Jacob returns, he is now focused on his family. See, God made sure that he got the birthright and the blessing, but he turned around and made sure that Jacob was prepared to be the patriarch in training. There you go. Now, sir, would you please go get me a cup of coffee, please?
Oh, I will.
Are you an overachieving oldest, a crowd-pleasing middle, a daredevil youngest? Do you even believe in these things? Birth order. How do you feel about birth order? Since the late 1800s and the founding of psychology, people have commissioned studies on birth order and how it will affect our lives. I have rarely found an oldest who doesn't believe in birth order in some capacity. Consider this. 21 of the first 23 astronauts were oldest, as are a majority of Congress. Of course, this is all just anecdotal evidence.
Truth Barista, we're living in such turbulent times with this coronavirus. What advice would you have for our audience?
Well, the first thing, you have to not give in to fear, right? I mean, you listened to a recent Dennis Prager.
Yes, and he was saying some wonderful things. Don't waste this time, but contact your friends by phone or by Skype and talk to them and your family. Do things that you haven't done for years. Do things together as a family in your own home, but do something productive and don't sit and mope and get depressed by what you hear on the news.
So on the negative side, don't give in to fear, right? That means we have to limit our consumption of the news, consumption of social media. Now, we don't want to be uninformed. We want to be informed, but man, talk about Debbie Downers, and stay away from the people who are being uber sensational about this and just stoking the fires. We don't need this. It is what it is, okay? It's like a pandemic, like a flu-type pandemic, although it has different characteristics. But, and this is the point I'd like to make too, is admittedly and apparently this has a high infection rate. So if we lower the possibility of infection, we'll have a lower potential for spread, and that will lower the severe number of cases and even deaths, and lower the strain on the hospitals so that they can keep pace and give proper care for those who need it. So really the positive thing is this is a great opportunity, like you said, to stay at home, stay in the neighborhood. I've seen a lot of people walking their dogs, hanging out with their kids, gardening already, doing some fantastic things. And you know what's the most important thing for us? You gotta stay in the coffee and you gotta stay in the Word.
What a great combination. Thanks for that encouragement, Truth Barista.
And don't forget to listen to the past episodes of the Truth Barista.
Great thought.
I am so glad that you were not disobedient in that.
You're the firstborn. Well, what can I say?
I'm not the firstborn, I'm the boss. That's what it is. Okay, let's go back to this firstborn thing. You could lose it because you're disqualified, like Ishmael. You could dismiss it by being Esau and trading it off. You could be disobedient. Let me tell you the story about Reuben, and many people miss this and how important it is. Reuben is the firstborn of Jacob. He's got the family responsibility. Well, Reuben demoted himself because there's this little story about he slept with one of his father's concubine, his auxiliary wife. We may not like it culturally. That's the way it was back then. You just got to deal with it. But here's the thing. Once Jacob had died, that auxiliary wife would have become Reuben's auxiliary wife. What Reuben was doing was pre-claiming and cementing his claim on the firstborn status and inheritance against his other brothers. That's what he was doing in doing so. Well, and it was probably a randy fellow anyway, but anyway, that's the underlying principle. Reuben was the firstborn of Leah, who was the first wife. So if he was disqualified, it would go to whom to be the firstborn? It would have to be the firstborn of the second wife, Rachel, and that was, you're looking at me with a blank expression. Who was Rachel's son? A little boy that went to Egypt.
Oh.
Joseph.
Joseph. There you go. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So when Reuben did this, Jacob said, son, you're a little bit too much interested in yourself. I think I'm going to transfer it to my son, Joseph, the firstborn of the second wife. And by the way, perfect rules of inheritance.
So it's always the firstborn, even in multi-wife situations.
Back in those days, it was always the firstborn, and then it would move down the line of sons until, and see, and this is where, remember we talked about the king and the priest thing? We're going to talk about, this is where the split starts happening.
Okay.
But I just want to touch for now. Reuben is the firstborn. He loses it, and it goes to Joseph. And it actually says that in 1 Chronicles 5:1 that Joseph is the firstborn. So we shouldn't be surprised that when Joseph goes down to Egypt and he has kids, he has two boys, one named Manasseh, one named Ephraim. And Jacob adopts his two boys as two tribes into the family of Israel. See, there's the patriarch bringing the fringe, because Ephraim and Manasseh were sons of a Hebrew, Joseph, and a Gentile. an Egyptian wife. So Jacob brings them into the family. Now Joseph has two portions within the family of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh. When they settle into the Holy Land, guess what? Joseph doesn't get one allotment of land named Joseph. He gets two under Ephraim and Manasseh. There's the double portion. In fact, Manasseh's land space is huge, and it goes on both sides of the Jordan. So here you see Joseph being blessed by his father. He gets a double portion of the tribes. He gets a double portion of the land, and his tribes become among the biggest in Israel.
Wow, that is I'm so glad you unpacked that.
Isn't that cool?
Because when you read about Manasseh and Ephraim, they're just sons. I mean, you don't realize the ramifications of the patriarchal system.
This is why we need to get into the culture, because it unlocks things. Now, here's another one. King David, was King David a firstborn? There's so many tough questions. Stop making me
stop and think. No.
He wasn't. He was the last born in the family.
Yeah, he was the baby.
He was the runt.
Yeah.
The ruddy runt, as they call him.
Right.
His firstborn, God says, no, Samuel, don't anoint this one for king.
Right.
That's not the man I've chosen. And he goes, yeah, but he's really handsome and he's really tall. I mean, he looks tall. And he's like, no, he doesn't have the right heart. Well, what about this one, Samuel says to the secondborn? God goes, nah. What about this third one? Nah. To God, it wasn't the family line, and it wasn't the stature or the good looks. It was the heart. And the runt of the family had the heart God was looking for.
But was this the first change that God was using for looking at the heart? Because usually it was the firstborn.
God would go according to the firstborn, and even in a sneaky case like Jacob, God honored that because that was the system that was set up. In this particular case, God was doing something unique. He was choosing David, the eighth kid in the family, because he had the heart, even though he didn't have the birth order. But what God is looking for ultimately, he's looking for birth order and heart. A firstborn son who has a heart after him. A firstborn son who will do his father's will. A firstborn son who will serve and not be served. A firstborn son who would lay his life down for his family. And you know exactly where I'm going. Jesus is the epitome of a firstborn son over a family.
Say, let me ask you this.
Okay. Numerology, yes.
David was 8.
Yep.
What's the number 8?
That's amazing that you would bring that up, because in biblical numerology, 7 is the number of completion, end of the week. So the first day of the new week is also known as the 8th day. 8 often has the idea of a new beginning.
Ooh,
wrapped
isn't that good?
Around it. So the people wanted Saul because he was tall and good looking. God started fresh with a runt, and he said, no, the heart's more important than anything else. I can work with this guy. I couldn't work with Saul.
And yet David's heart was hard-pressed after God. He pursued God with his heart, yet he was very sinful.
He had his moments. He was human.
I mean, a lot of human. I mean, I don't know of too many people.
Okay. He committed murder and adultery. But besides that, he's a perfect guy. No. What that says to me, that's actually, in a way, encouraging, because even though David sinned, what marked him is he repented when God touched his heart. He was responsive to God, which Saul wasn't. And that's what God needs in a firstborn son, because that firstborn son has to have a tender, responsive heart to the family, that when there's a family need, that firstborn son jumps into action.
And so it also says that a good heart responds properly in repentance.
See, and that's the thing, and we can conclude this here and do another Bible study on the rest of this, but this is the thing that's really working on my heart too, is that we all do sin. We all struggle in these areas, but our firstborn stands up for us. Our firstborn, Jesus, gave his life so that even if we are marginalized by selling ourselves off to sin, he does his job by paying the debt so that we might be restored to the Father's family, and we can all be then attached to his homestead. In my Father's house are many rooms. Why? Because we're all in training. We're all in process. We weren't expected to be perfect in this life, but we are expected to be perfecting as we go, and we will be perfected when we reach the end of our lives and we walk into our Father's arms. This whole idea of patriarchs and firstborns is so important because it tells the gospel. It's the function of the gospel, which was redeeming, bringing people back, restoring. Adam and Eve lived in their father's house. They broke the rules and they sold themselves into sin. God's whole plan from before even the world was created was to set up a way to restore humanity back to his home, everybody if possible, and it would come through the work of his firstborn son.
Isn't that so good? So where are we going next time we gather?
We're going to complete, Amazing Larry, this whole idea of the firstborn, because not only is Jesus called the firstborn, we're going to explore what that means. Israel, the nation, is called God's firstborn. And there's something to that too prophetically for the end times.
You know, Truth Barista, this is going to be a great series. I just hope that more people want to listen in, right?
Hi, that would be great. And by the way, now we're going to break from our theater of the mind at the Erzatz coffee shop here. If you really like this program, and this is speaking to you, I encourage you, Jay the Truth Barista, that you would email us at thetruthbarista@gmail.com or highbeamministry@gmail.com. Once again, that's thetruthbarista@gmail.com or highbeamministry, as in car high beams, highbeamministry@gmail.com. And let Amazing Larry and I know how this program has ministered to you. Share it with your friends on social media. We're on iTunes and looking at other platforms. We want to know how this ministry outreach is really touching your life and what God has been doing for you. And by the way, you know, we don't live on air here either, even though we're on the air. We really do need your help financially. So go to the website. There's a donate button there through PayPal. It's a blessing. Look for the picture of the tip jar or the PayPal donate button, and we would appreciate anything. But we are here to serve you.
That's right.
We are here to make sure that you are, first of all, come back to the Father's house and to teach and train you and to educate you and to encourage you in the things of God. This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast.